this is Himanshu, a philosophy student at IIT Bombay. I welcome and thank you everyone for joining us this Sunday afternoon. As you know, today we are starting with the first lecture in Thinking Time lecture series organized by Let's Talk Tattva, a philosophy discussion forum. Let's Talk Tattva is an independent initiative focused on providing a rich discussion platform for people engaged in academic, non academic, or traditional scholarship in philosophy. Philosophy for us does not entail any particular tradition of philosophy, but the activity of thinking per se. Therefore, thinking, whether it is through classical texts, modern university scholarship, ritual practices, art, music, or cinema, is what we aim to foster. We have been regularly organizing philosophical discussions by professors and scholars. Besides philosophy students, our audiences are people interested in philosophy but not indulged in academically. So, for this lecture series we are starting today, our aim is to focus on the idea of time or philosophy of time through various streams of philosophy, Sanskrit Shastra studies, or what is called as classical Indian philosophy, studies on modern Indian culture or history. We believe attending our ears towards those who have something to say on the idea of time can help us think more profoundly and lively about time, past, history, future, and the way they shape our surroundings, or vice versa. When we talk about the problem of time in Indian philosophy, or basically the classical discourse in philosophy in India, we find two streams of thought talking about sustaining, continuous, and permanent and substantial being. So when the Buddhist philosophical development tried to oppose these ideas through challenging these ideas by developing momentariness and focusing upon the changing aspect of reality and saying that whatever is efficient is real and therefore must be changing. No permanent reality can be real for Buddhists. If we look into this matter deeply and to understand what Raghu will present us today, I'll read from an excerpt from a book, uh, Analysis of Time in Indian Philosophy, where the profound scholar Sarvāstivāda talk about the Buddhist idea of time. So the Buddhist philosophical analysis reveals that the real time is an instant. It's not therefore an time or absolute time spread through all the three aspects of time, past, future, or present. They understand time as the instant which is real because it is efficient to produce next moment, and therefore it's real. Time as universal receptacle is absurd for Buddhists, as it cannot be said to have efficiency apart from the things. Their separation is merely imaginary. The idea of time as a real per se is rejected through a refutation of the ideas of duration and continuity. Cherbatsky, in the following passages, puts in an interesting manner the Buddhist view that duration is a fiction, which will be opposite to a sustaining idea of time or reality in the opposing systems of, let's say, Brahmana schools. I quote Sharbatsky: if a thing exists at a moment A, it cannot also exist at some moment B. For to exist really at the moment A means not to have any real existence at the moment B or any other moment. If we thus admit that the same thing continues to exist at the moment B, this could only mean that it at once really exists and does not really exist at the moment A. If a thing could have real duration through several moments, it would represent a real unity existing at once at different times. Either in enduring unity, a fiction, and real are only the moments, or the moments are fictions and real is only duration. For the Buddhists, the moment alone are real. Duration is a fiction. For if it were a reality, it would be reality existing at different times at once. That is, existing at the same time, non-existing at a given moment. Unquote. Now let us welcome Mr. Raghu Menon to understand how do Buddhist thinkers respond to these challenges and propose their momentary analysis of reality of time. Mr. Raghu is a Ph.D. researcher at Manipal Centre for Humanities. So before we hand over the forum to Mr. Raghu. Uh, just to note that he'll be speaking for 30 to 45 minutes, and then we will enter into a discussion or Q&A sessions. So you can either raise your hands or directly ask your questions or put your queries in chat box. And this is how would like to conclude the discussion. Thank you for accepting our invitation, Raghu. Welcome. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Himanshu, for your introduction. Uh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I would like to start with a disclaimer because I'm not a classically trained Buddhist philosopher, and my discovery of Buddhist philosophy sort of happened in relation to my interest in continental philosophy. So what I'm about to present today are certain aspects of Buddhist philosophy that interested me while I was doing my research. And because of the paucity of time, I'm going to primarily focus on the Sarvāstivāda idea of time, which, as Himanshu was talking about, in relation to the doctrine of momentariness, offers something slightly different to what other Buddhist schools, especially in the Abhidharma tradition, proposed in relation to time. And I'll see if I can share my screen here because I've made a rough PPT. I hope you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Okay.
It's visible.
Yeah, thank you. So basically, I would like to start with a few contemporary theories of time, just so that.
Maybe you can zoom in a little bit so can or to put it in presentation mode.
Okay.
Fine.
Right. Yeah. So I would like to focus. I would like to start off this talk by focusing a little bit on the certain contemporary theories of time, just so that we. Uh, so I'm not saying that there is a one-to-one correspondence between these theories and what's going on in Buddhism, but at least in recent years, a lot of Buddhist scholars have tried to frame the debates between Sarvāstivādins and other Buddhist schools in relation to this discussion between eternalism and presentism. So I would like to give a brief overview of certain theories of time which are being discussed in philosophy uh, contemporarily, and I would like to sort of place the Sarvāstivāda idea of time in relation to it. So most of you would have heard of McTaggart and his very influential paper on the unreality of time. So in that paper, McTaggart posed two different ways of ordering time. The first, which he called A series, is a kind of temporal ordering according to which we can talk about a past, present, and future in relation to events. And the second, what he calls a B series, is basically an ordering of time which is ordered in relation to transitive asymmetric relations, such as earlier than, later than, and simultaneous with. So in the A series, we have this idea of the passage of time, time as a flow or a movement, while in B series, it's mostly this idea of temporal directionality that sort of emerges. So according to McTaggart, he says that B series cannot occur without A series. And this is based on this idea or this assumption that time must be related to change. And according to McTaggart, the only way in which we can account for change is through the A series, which is by projecting a property of flow or passage onto time. So we must assume, or we must speak about time as if a particular event is moving from the future onto the present and then becomes past. So his whole paper is basically attempting to show that there is a certain contradiction associated with the A series, and therefore time is necessarily unreal. So, at least according to McTaggart, A series is what emerges when we arbitrarily attribute a particular event in B series as the present. So, in relation to that, we can say that the A series constitutes a particular temporal passage. So, as such, he says that the distinctions of the A series are dynamic, whereas those of the latter are static. Just means that if something is, if an event X is earlier than Y, it will always remain earlier than Y, irrespective of whether time flows or not. So the idea that, so in any case, he says that for time to be real, it must have both A and B properties, but as I mentioned earlier, time is characterized by change, and only the A series can truly account for it. So most of McTaggart's argument is based on this idea that an event cannot be simultaneously past, present, and future. So it's somewhat contradictory to say something is both past and present, or something is both present and future, and so on. So so he also takes up one of the common objections that can be raised in relation to this point by saying that even if we take this idea that something is past, present, and future not simultaneously but successively, we run into certain paradoxes or contradictions. For example, if we consider a statement like X is past, so if we at least if we try to talk about one event in isolation from other temporal predicates and in relation to only one temporal predicate, we find that we still cannot actually speak about it meaningfully. So if we consider the statement X is past, for example, McTaggart says that we also have to say that X is future in some past moment, present in a different past moment, and past in the present moment, and so on. So if we ask a question as to when the statement X is future in some past moment is true, we have to add another tense predicate. We can only say that X is future in some past moment is true in the present. So what he's trying to say is that each time we try to account for a statement of this sort, we have to add more and more, or like a second order A series and a third order A series to account for the second order, and so on, leading to this infinite regress. And at times he also refers to it as a vicious circle. So every time one attempts to spell out how events can have one property, a property, and not another, using 10 statements, one ends up with another statement that needs an explanation of the same kind. So what McTaggart proposes instead is a non-temporal C series, which is related to the B series, but it doesn't have a directionality per se. So for example, if I say that, for example, let's say reality has a certain order, let's say A, B, C, D, E, and F. McTaggart would say that all that is true about the C series is that a certain order exists, that C comes after B, D comes after C, but there's no directionality. So B series is what emerges when the C series is fused with the A series, such that we can add a certain directionality. So we can say that it's either A, B, C, D, E, and F, or F, E, D, C, B, and A, and so on. So the reason why McTaggart is useful, I mean, a lot of people have reservations with McTaggart's theory of time or his refutation of time. For example, Altham, in one influential reading, says that McTaggart conflates temporal copulas with temporal predicates, for example, in statements of the sort that we considered. But what's useful in relation to McTaggart's theory is that it helps us talk about certain theories of time in relation to whether it's an A theory or a B theory. And in relation to A theory, we find quite a few positions emerging. So one of the positions that we can talk about is presentism, which a lot of the Buddhist theories, especially what Himanshu was talking about earlier in relation to momentariness, can be classified as a presentist theory. But the school that I'm going to discuss today, which is Sarvāstivāda, is often referred to as eternalist because they believe that, or they argue that both past, present, and future all exist at once or simultaneously, or they all three have real existence. So in that sense, we can also talk about different kinds of theories of time. There's one way in which we can talk about a block universe. I'm sure some of you who are familiar with relativity and physics might be able to explain this further. So if we think of space-time as if it's spread out as a manifold, we can talk about the universe as if it's a block, which encompasses everything that has happened and will ever happen. So in certain theories, for example, like moving spotlight theory, what is usually considered present maybe simply be talked about as a spotlight that is being passed onto this block. And there are certain other theories that emerge, for example, growing universe theories, which consider only past and present as real, while the future is something that is open. We can also talk about, in relation to the growing universe theory, we can also talk about open futures and branching times and so on and so forth. and one of the interesting features that emerge from this is a four-dimensional theory. Like the Buddhist scholar J. Garfield, for example, compares the Sarvāstivāda model of time, or their position on time, to what is being talked about as four-dimensional theory in contemporary philosophy. So four-dimensional theory is basically this idea. Again, I think it's quite influenced by the relativistic conception of time as well. So if we consider space-time as this manifold that is spread out, we can talk about uh, a particular continuum or a series within that block uh, as time slices, or a continuum of time slices. So there are quite a lot of philosophers and even physicists use certain analogies to explain what this is. For example, some people talk about a space-time worm. For example, a particular causal series or a particular causal continuum could be compared to the movement of a worm across this block. So what it means is that if we are talking about a particular entity existing through time, we can also say that the particular entity will have temporal parts. So what constitutes that particular entity will be a fusion of every single temporal part or the temporal slice. So this is usually known as the worm theory of the four-dimensional approach to time. And there is something else which is also usually referred to as a stage theory, where every single temporal slice is given autonomy rather than looking at all the temporal slices of a continuum as a whole. So what we are talking about in the stage theory is that one slice of time, or whenever we are talking about a person, or when we are talking about personal pronouns, it only refers to one particular slice of time rather than a collection of time slices together. So it is in this context that J. Garfield, for example, tries to say that Sarvāstivāda in theory could perhaps contribute something to what is nowadays being discussed as 4D theory, because the idea of a person is no longer something that can be considered as a fusion, or it's not something that we can properly speaking say that has temporal parts that come together to constitute a person, but also we have to talk about a dehomuncularized way of looking at these time slices as well, because each slice corresponds to one own, like a particular idea of personhood. So what I mean to say is that there is no subject that is enduring across this particular block of space-time, and we look at it from the stage view of the four-dimensional theory. So just giving this brief overview of four-dimensional theories, I want to basically move on to Buddhist philosophy. Some of the basic principles of Buddhist philosophy, it's convenient to enumerate certain basic principles of Buddhist philosophy before moving on to the Sarvāstivāda idea of time. So essentially, or one of the core ideas of Buddhist philosophy is this notion that existence is pervaded by suffering, or the world around us is basically characterized by suffering or dukkha. So what is this suffering? So at least according to the Buddha, suffering is particularly a state that emerges from a fundamental ignorance or a primal confusion about the way things really are, which basically refers to a tendency to take phenomena as being permanent, independent, or as enduring, or as having an essential nature. So this idea of dukkha and the ignorance that gives rise to it could be used to frame certain basic principles of Buddhist philosophy. One of the first core principle is impermanence, or anitya, the fact that all phenomena are impermanent. There is nothing that is permanent in reality. And the second idea is that of dependent origination, or pratitya samutpada, which is basically a concept of causal interdependence, because nothing exists independently or nothing originates independently. Any phenomenon that originates in experience is basically a consequence of many other phenomena that act upon each other in this dependent manner. So basically, it's a theory of causal interdependence. And because if you put these two ideas together, and if everything is impermanent and everything is an outcome of dependent origination, we also have to say that a self as we conceive it, or a personhood as we conceive it, is a fallacious notion. So which is basically what Buddhists refer to as this idea of anatman, or no self. At least in the earliest stage of Buddhism, as far as as I gather, most of the emphasis was on this idea of the refutation of the self, or this notion of anatman. And towards the later stages of Buddhism, especially in Madhyamaka traditions, this emphasis is also given to anything that is taken to be individuated, anything that is taken to have an essence. So therefore, you get this notion of shunyata, or emptiness. So at least Buddha describes dependent origination as in the following way: when this exists, that comes to be; with the arising of this, that arises; when this does not exist, that does not come to be; with the cessation of this, that ceases. So basically, it's as I mentioned, it's just a theory of causal interdependence. And Buddha also talks about this. I find this interesting in a sense, because Buddha also really talks about the notion of kalpana, or imagination, or even like a faculty of conceptual construction in the origin of suffering. Because if we think about it, one of the reasons why we form or foster an attachment to this sense of I, or the subjectivity, or even the fact that subjectivity emerges, is primarily because of the manner in which we acquire concepts from perception. Perhaps there might be some parallels to empirical philosophy to be garnered here, but in any case, Buddha appears to say that the manner in which we acquire concepts from perception, from direct perception, results in our imagination thinking about the possibility of past lives and possible future lives, which results in this attachment towards this idea of a subject that endures, a subject that anticipates, a subject that desires, subject that imagines alternative ways of living. All of this results in a certain kind of attachment to the self that results in suffering. So in some sense, kalpana, or this, or our tendency to construct concepts, or our tendency to imagine things in a certain way, is also an important facet of suffering. So in the sutras, Buddha says that all existing things, anything that exists, can be classified into 5 kinds. So we have some kind of dualism emerging here, because there's a material form that is now that you can call rupa, which can also be the material or corporeal form, and then you have 4 incorporeal or mental kinds: feeling or vedana, which relates to experiences of pleasure and pain; cognition, which relates to all propositional aspects of the mind; volitions and emotions, or samskara; consciousness, or vijnana. So consciousness here does not refer to it just refers to a single moment of consciousness, which is also intentional in nature. So all these 5 kinds come together to form phenomena. So we can say that all phenomena are simply varying assemblages of these 5 aggregates or bundles, also known as skandhas. Which is to say that anything that is considered whole, if they can be divided or further analyzed into these 5 kinds. So these are also the objects according to which these are the objects of grasping that lend themselves to an identification as me, I, or myself. It's through this compound or assemblage of these 5 kinds of characteristics that we can talk about a person as such. So these are also the 5 factors that constitute a person or a self. Accordingly, if any phenomenon that is constituted of personality is also imbued with some kind of pain, these aggregates are also, in Buddha's view, sources of dukkha. So basically, following the Buddha's death, the Abhidharma tradition that emerged in the wake of his death, so it primarily arose out of a need to systematize Buddha's teachings, because Buddha spoke or altered his teachings depending on the audience. To the philosophically inclined audience, he would speak in a philosophically inclined manner, or when it comes to ordinary people, he would speak through parables or aphorisms. So certain contradictions within Buddha's teachings resulted in the need to systematize it, or to develop certain basic principles, especially as it relates to the soteriological concerns of Buddhism. So initially, Abhidharma tradition were particularly interested or engaged in forming matrices teachings, or classifying teachings according to certain kinds. And so basically, it was a classificatory, it was an exercise in classification and taxonomy that resulted in this Abhidharma movement. But it became extremely sophisticated, and also this attempt to systematize Buddha's teachings also resulted in certain conflicts, which resulted in all the various schools of the Abhidharma tradition. So in any case, Abhidharma tradition sort of took the skanda theory a little further. And one of the reasons, or one of the reasons that we can identify, especially as scholars like Cousins, Williams, and Tribe point out, is that it also had something to do with the practice of insight meditation. So at least according to the Abhidharmans, meditation refers to an activity whereby we probe our mind until we reach a state upon which no further probing can be done. So the philosophical counterpart of this act of insight meditation resulted in what we now know as Dharma theory. So Dharmas in Abhidharma philosophy refer to the ultimate constituents of phenomena. Like we cannot, so Dharmas are what are not further analyzable. So dharmas are the ultimate constituents of phenomena, and we cannot talk about dharmas as atoms. They are more like psychophysical events. So they are more dynamic, and quite a lot of the Abhidharma scholars of Abhidharma, like Colette Cox and Paul Williams, they talk about dharmas as being dynamic events, but yet they are also elemental events which cannot be reduced any further. So this notion of analyzing or let's say dividing reality into its ultimately real components resulted in this preoccupation with dharmas, or the ultimate constituents of phenomena. And various schools of Abhidharma will classify dharmas differently. For example, the Theravada, if I'm right, talk about 82 different types of dharmas, while the Sarvāstivāda only talk about 75. And they also talk about conditioned and unconditioned dharmas. Especially unconditioned dharmas are dharmas that are associated with nirvana, for example. But in any case, I won't talk about the exact nature of this taxonomy or the number of dharmas that each school identifies. Most of it usually has something to do with the soteriological concerns of that particular school. But in any case, this identification of the fundamental dharmas are let's say, a consequence of what you might call a dharmic analysis, or an analysis of phenomena into the basic constituents. So in certain Abhidharma schools, for example, like Rupa could be again analyzed further into, for example, solidity or heat, and so on and so forth. So basically anything that can be analyzed further is not real. So we find the earliest systematization, or the clear conceptualization of mereological nihilism, which characterizes Buddhist philosophy perhaps as a whole. Basically this notion that anything that is divisible or analyzable cannot be ultimately real. So this also results in two conceptions of truth, where we can talk about persons and things in a very conventional sense, and also absolute truths, which are real in the ultimate or fundamental sense. So I do have something to say about this notion of conventional truth, and for example, its relation to time and causality. I'll briefly touch upon it before I wind up the talk, but I will move on further to the doctrine of momentariness that Himanshu was alluding to in his introduction. So one of the consequences of the Abhidharma school is basically the development of what you now know as Kshanavada, or the doctrine of momentariness. So when we talk about dharmas as the ultimate factors or constituents of experience, they also say that these dharmas are momentary and evanescent. That is, they vanish as soon as they arise, and they exist only for a moment. So quite a lot of debates emerge as to what a moment is, and Himanshu already spoke about Sarvātsky's treatment of this notion of moment. But we also see various different interpretations emerging in relation to doctrine of momentariness. So at least we can say that moment, at least in the Abhidharma philosophy, denotes the smallest conceivable instant that is necessary to exercise birth, duration, decay, and vanishing, like whatever time or whatever duration is So the smallest conceivable instant that is required for all these four activities to take place. But for example, von Rospat's study of this concept of momentariness is quite interesting in that sense, because we find even attempts within various Abhidharma schools to calculate exactly what a moment is. But I'm inclined to again accept what Sarvāstivāda and, for example, Kalapahana say, where they speak about momentariness, or this notion of a moment as this attempt to seize the infinitesimal, or this idea, this notion of or at least trying to theorize this notion of infinitesimal through let's say concepts. And I don't know if I'm right to make this comparison, but I will just put it out there. I think Leibniz, for example, speaks about infinitesimal micro perceptions, especially in relation to his calculus, for example, like that. So if we are talking about the sound of a wave, for example, what we hear is the composite sound made by many different droplets of water colliding upon on each other. So there are, for example, like anyway, what I'm trying to say is that there are these attempts to try and seize this concept of an infinitesimal, and perhaps this doctrine of momentariness is perhaps a consequence of such attempts, at least according to Sarvāstivāda and Kalapahana. So now that we have established, or now that we have briefly considered what the doctrine of momentariness is, we can perhaps get to the heart of the debates between, let's say, the Sarvāstivādan school and the other Abhidharmin schools. So if the most Abhidharmin schools argue that dharmas exist only in the present, while Sarvāstivādans argue that they exist in the past, present, and future. So there are so this cuts to the heart of what is currently talked about as the debate between presentism and eternalism. So if we are assuming that only present events exist, it results in certain problems. For example, we can make meaningful assertions regarding involving statements that deal with past and future. For example, I can make a statement that says that Gandhi was born in 1869 and died in 1948. It's a true statement, but what is the truth maker in that particular statement? Because Gandhi as the referent, the referent of the subject, Gandhi, is no longer present, right? So certain problems like this resulted in people assuming this eternalist position, which is basically to talk about past and future events or as having some kind of existence, right? So we find a similar kind of debate emerging between Sarvāstivādans and the other Abhidharmin schools as well. So one of the questions that we can talk about is, if the dharma in the first moment vanishes before the dharma in the second moment arises, would it be possible to establish any kind of causal relations between the two moments, right? Because is there even the possibility of a cause forming an effect in the second moment? The second point that we have to discuss is, if dharmas exist only momentarily, how does one account for privation? One of the examples that I can talk about is, let's say, when we perceive smoke, we also infer fire from it. So the Sarvāstivādans take up this idea. For example, if we only cognize one moment at a time, and our one moment is characterized only by one cognition, how do we account for vyapti, for example? First, there is the cognition of the smoke itself, and then there is the cognition of the pervasion. So if these are separate moments, how do we infer that there is, for example, fire as a result of the experience or the perception of smoke? So questions like this resulted in the Sarvāstivādans trying to engage with the notion that perhaps past and future dharmas can also exist in a certain way. Again, from a doctrinal point of view, especially as it relates to karma, the question of karmic retribution, or the consequence of past action, must also be explained. And if it has to be explained, for example, certain actions or certain actions do not discharge its effects until there is a certain delay between a particular action and its effect. And how do we account for it? Should the cause continue to exist in some way until its effect is discharged, or should we have a different idea about how it is to be considered? So all of these, so for example, the Sarvāstivādins refer to one argument that the Buddha makes, that an action does not, that this idea that an action can continue to sort of exert karmic influence. So if that is the case, how do we account for the temporal nature of that, the idea of karma? So the Sarvāstivādins, again, perhaps in an unorthodox manner, attempt to solve the problem by postulating an unchanging substratum underlying the momentary flashes of dharmas, and by granting causal efficacy to the immediately preceding dharma. So basically what they are saying is that the intrinsic nature of a dharma does not change, but what changes is in fact a particular characteristic of the dharma as it migrates through time. And also to account for the unchanging substratum underlying the dharmas, it's the svabhava, as well as the causal relations between them. The Sarvāstivādins were compelled to posit the existence of dharmas in all three epochs or dimensions of time. So one of the main objections, we find this in Abhidharma Kosha Bhashya, where Vasubandhu states that if dharmas exist in all three times, it appears to entail that they're in fact eternal, which seems to violate the doctrine of impermanence. And so also this notion that dharma has an intrinsic identity that does not change also appears to violate the doctrine of impermanence. So in a sense, the Sarvāstivādan position is something of an outlier in Abhidharma philosophy and Buddhist philosophy as a whole. And also this idea that there is an inherent or an intrinsic nature that does not change, but it's only a particular quality or a mode that changes, also somehow draws it closer to the Sankhya view of philosophy as well. So in any case, the Sarvāstivādan view seems to be that without a past or a future, it appears impossible for a present factor to be causally dependent on past factors or act as the condition for future ones. So this is a central paradox that various Sarvāstivādins attempt to solve with their respective theories. So I will just briefly discuss the four main Sarvāstivādan theories of time, especially as it is discussed in Abhidharma Kosha, and end my discussion and this talk, but by also briefly discussing the manner in which Sanghabhadra sort of took up this idea. So basically, there are four different ways in which Sarvāstivādins theorize time, or this particular notion of time that I discussed. So according to Sarvāstivādins, there are four kinds or four ways according to which they postulate the manner in which dharmas migrate through time. So we can talk about a difference in the mode of existence, or a difference in a particular characteristic or quality, a difference in the state, or the difference in temporal relativity. And according to Vasubandhu, the third position, which is attributed to Vasumitra, is the best or the most plausible position. And I will discuss all of these four positions one by one. And the four views are described by Vasubandhu also articulate the four significant ways in which Sarvāstivādins postulate a difference that explains the manner in which things change in time, or dharmas change in time. So the first view, or the first view of time that we find in Sarvāstivādan theories is what is attributed to Dharmatrada. So there's this idea that when a dharma passes through the three times, what differs is the bhava, or the mode of the dharma, and not its svabhava. And he provides an analogy to explain it as well. So a dharma traversing time exists with the same substantial nature that they have in the present. So what changes is the temporality itself, a thing's mode of being. And the analogy is basically that the dharma doesn't change its nature in the three times. In the same way, for example, milk doesn't change its color when it becomes whey, or a gold vase doesn't lose its goldness when it is broken. So Vasubandhu obviously refutes this idea, this theory, on the basis that it very much resembles the Sankhya point of view, and also that the idea that something cannot remain the same when it changes in some manner. So So basically the notion that a dharma changes, but its svabhava does not change is contradictory, because if dharma changes, so should its svabhava. Or that is at least Vasubandhu's refutation of Dharmatrada. And the second view, which is attributed to Goshaka, basically states that dharmas only change their lakshana, which is the quality or characteristic in the three times. So when a dharma is in the past, it is conjoined with the quality of being past. But concurrently, it is not severed from its connection to the qualities of present and future. So again, it is interesting to sort of compare this with what McTaggart was speaking in relation to isolation of temporal predicates. So when we talk about past, present, and future, we can also speak about something being present in the past or future in the past. So we find a certain kind of similarity, but not really a structural similarity. But at least we can find a similar idea at work when we talk about Goshaka's view of time. So and it's the example that he gives, for example, is a dharma existing in a particular time is not detached from the characteristics of the other two times, in the same way a man attached to one particular woman is not detached from other women. So this notion that so at least according to Vasubandhu, this is a problematic notion, because even if we say that a dharma in the past has a particular quality, but it's still connected to the present and future in some way, what he's in fact saying is that, or what he's in fact alluding to, is the lack of temporal distinctions itself. So according to Vasubandhu, this would be a contradiction as well, because even if you say that it has a different quality, but at the same time conjoined with at the same time it is also not severed from its connection to the other dimensions, what he's in fact eliminating is the notion of temporal distinction in the first place. So therefore Vasubandhu also dismisses this theory. So the third view, which is attributed to Vasumitra, which is by far the most popular view, and this is also endorsed in the Mahavibhasha as well, or out of the four views that are discussed in Sarvāstivāda in text, this is by far the one that has enjoyed the most traction. So according to Vasubandhu, so the third view attributed to Vasumitra states that the dharmas only change on account of the difference in their avastha or the position in the three times, and not due to a difference in its nature. So he compares this to, for example, the manner in which beads are placed in an abacus. So depending on where exactly the beads are positioned in the abacus, it can take up a different number. Or for example, another example that we can provide, again, what is cited in Abhidharmakosha Bhashya, is, for example, a token or a counting block, which is placed on the square of ones can be called 1, or a square of tens can be called 10, but the block itself does not really change, right? So the manner in which a block is 1 or a 10 or 100 depends on the position in which you actually, again, like the analogy of the abacus is perhaps the best one that we can offer here. So something is past, present, and future by virtue of the position which it takes up in a particular causal series. So just as a token changes its number depending on its position or the square it occupies, a dharma goes by three different names, but without changing its essential nature when it passes through the three epochs. Furthermore, the three temporal positions are determined by the karitra, or the activity or the causal efficiency of the dharmas, and it is in relation to this very activity that the dharmas are said to be migrating through time. And the fourth view, so I'll get back to the third view in a bit, but the fourth view, which is attributed to Buddhadeva, advocates a relativistic understanding of the tri-temporal dharmas. So dharma proceeding through the three times may be called past, present, or future, relative to that which precedes and to that which follows. In the same way, the one and the same woman could be both a daughter and a mother, depending on the perspective that one, or depending on the perspective of the frame of reference that one adopts. So according to Vasubandhu, at least, the three theories, with the exception of Vasumitra, basically refers to the same idea in some way or the other, and therefore can be refuted. So, but the third view, which is attributed to Vasumitra, is interesting because of the manner in which he sort of defines the temporal position related to Karitra. So at least according to this view, Vasubandhu's summary of Vasumitra's theory of time can be summarized as follows. So for example, when the factor has not yet exercised its charitra, it is said to be future. When it is exercising its activities, it is said to be present. And when its charitra has ceased, it is said to be past. So there are different ways in which the four theories of time in the Sarvāstivāda tradition has been interpreted. For example, Dhammajyoti says that time is nothing but the activity of dharmas, and it's something that we superimpose. And this is again based on Sanghabhadra's interpretation of these four theories, which we will briefly consider. And Frauwallner, for example, says that it is not the real existence of things in all three times that these philosophers were trying to solve, but because I was part of the established doctrine. But what they were trying to answer was, the question that they were trying to answer was, if things are really existent in all three stages of time in the same way, what makes them different when one refers to them at one time as future and at one time as past or present? So it's this modal difference that the Sarvāstivāda philosophers were more interested in. And again, someone like Philip Maas will say that we find a certain logical sequence in the four theories because one treats temporality as being intrinsic to factors, and we end up with a theory in which temporality is exclusively the result of the factors' mutual relation. In any case, what I want to emphasize is that most of these scholarly interpretations are based on Sanghabhadra's response to Vasubandhu. So I will not discuss the exact manner in which Sanghabhadra responds to Vasubandhu because it can take up more time. But essentially, Vasubandhu, I'll cite one example that Vasubandhu states to refute Vasumita's theory of time, or at least his notion of Karitra. So for example, if we are talking about a series of eyes, like for example, what is the Karitra of an eye? And Vasubandhu says that the Karitra of an eye is to produce vision. So what about the state of an eye in a dark room or while in the state of sleep? Is it actually discharging its Karitra? Or if it's not discharging its Karitra, can we say that the eye does not exist? So Sanghabhadra's response to this notion or this problem of an eye that does not produce vision in a dark room or when in the state of sleep is to sort of separate this notion of Karitra from what he would call Samarthya or Vyapara, or to sort of separate this concept of activity from what he would call efficacy or capacity. So he says that this notion of activity or this concept of activity simply refers to a dharma's ability to produce its next moment, right? Not exactly to the efficacy or capacity in the former example to produce vision. So an eye in the dark room exercises its karitra in the present when it produces its next moment. So it might not produce vision, but it produces its next moment. Therefore, it's discharging its karitra. But on the other hand, this efficacy or its capacity to produce vision only takes place when certain conditions are met. For example, the presence of light. So most of Sanghabhadra's refutation of Vasubandhu now revolves around the manner in which present existence is somehow modally distinct from past and future existence. So most of Sanghabhadra's works have now been translated, and all the extant works exist in Tibetan translations. And the only existing translations I think are found in Colette Cox's works and also in Dhammajyoti's works, where all the relevant concepts of time that Sanghabhadra refers to are discussed. But in any case, what Sanghabhadra offers is the final summation or the best summary of the Sarvāstivāda position. And the important consequence of Sanghabhadra's idea is to separate karitra from efficacy, or to separate this notion of activity from efficacy or capacity. So one is related to present. Something is present when it exercises its karitra. That is when it produces its own next moment. While something can only produce a certain capacity, for example, the vision, only when certain conditions are met. So those capacities can continue. So we can speak about past existing and future also existing in a certain way in relation to these capacities, right? For example, a seed that results in sprouting. For example, the seed. So in one sense, the seed produces its own next seed moment by discharging its karitra. So karitra only refers to one seed moment producing the second. So when we are talking about its capacity to produce a sprout, we also have to speak about this capacity in conjunction with certain other conditions. For example, the looseness of the soil, the moistness of the soil. So Sanghabhadra, in some sense, at least as far as I understand it, separates capacity from activity and therefore uses this to talk about past and future as having different modalities.